wind in Dust Haven never rested. It was a constant, weary sigh that lifted the fine alkali dust from the street and sent it whispering against cracked window panes and weathered doors. The dust was as thin as salt, and it settled on everything, coating the tongues of thirsty men and dusting the black hats of solemn women. New Mexico baked under a sun that had forgotten mercy, and the long drought had drawn the very life out of the land, leaving behind a palette of beige and brown. The town well, the heart of the community, was shrinking daily, its water tasting more and more of the earth it was leaving behind. Down the single main street, the saloon doors swung open and shut, spilling out noise and the scent of stale beer into the heat, a frantic sort of cheer against the quiet desperation. Beyond the last buildings, the cattle pens stood mostly empty, a stark boneyard where the skulls of starved longhorns stared at the empty sky with hollow eyes. Eliza May Carter knew the language of this harsh land. At 25, she was a widow, though she rarely felt the title fit her. It was a word for sitting and grieving, and she had never had the time for either. Her husband, Tom, had been taken by a fever and a wrongly measured dose of medicine 2 years back, leaving her with little more than his name and a deep-seated fear of the squiggles in books and on bottles. She was a woman made of sinew and resolve, her hands calloused from reins and ranch work, her face tanned by the relentless sun. She moved with an easy grace that belonged in a saddle, her steps sure and her gaze steady. She earned her keep working for a small rancher just outside of town and cleaning the rooms at the boarding house. Her days a cycle of hard labor that kept her thoughts from straying toward the things she could not change. Chief among them, the black marks on paper that held a power over people she could not comprehend. She feared those marks like a fire, a secret shame she guarded so closely it had become a part of her soul. Into this parched and waiting town came a man who seemed to be made of different stuff altogether. Dr. Samuel Quinn was a creature of the East, a land of rain and green and ordered streets. He was in his early 30s, with a stubborn set to his jaw that was softened by the kindness in his eyes that were often hidden behind a pair of spectacles. He arrived not with a gunslinger's swagger, but with a heavy wagon packed with a tall medicine chest, a leather roll of surgical instruments that gleamed with a terrifying beauty, several large crates of books, and a strange, cast-iron contraption he called a hand press. He intended to bring modern medicine to this forgotten corner of the world, a notion that seemed as foreign and unlikely as a river flowing through the center of town. Dust Haven was a town of gray morals, a place where right and wrong were often blurred by the glare of the sun and the thirst for survival. Sheriff Harlan Pike kept the peace, which mostly meant he kept his own pockets full. He was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, a servant of the highest bidder. That bidder was usually Gideon Rusk, a cattle baron who had amassed a vast territory of land by means a lot like the drought, slowly squeezing the life out of smaller ranchers until they had no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar. The town's moral compass, or what passed for one, was Abigail Loom, the pastor's wife. She saw sin in every shadow and took particular interest in the perceived failings of other women, her judgments as sharp and cutting as shards of glass. She stood in stark contrast to her husband, the gentle Reverend Loom, a man who spoke of grace but was often drowned out by his wife's fire and brimstone. The town's news network was Jed the postman, a wiry man who moved with a nervous energy and collected gossip as if it were currency. And in the heat and sparks of the smithy worked old Tom, a blacksmith who had lost 2 fingers to a careless hammer but none of his cantankerous spirit. His words were often foul, but his heart, most people grudgingly admitted, was in the right place. He had a soft spot for the town's children, especially Nina, a 14-year-old girl of Tiwa and Mexican blood who moved with the quickness of a roadrunner and possessed a curiosity as vast as the desert itself. Eliza was riding back toward town, the sun a hot weight on her shoulders, when she heard the commotion. It was a sound that did not belong on the quiet, dusty track leading to Dust Haven. The sharp crack of a gunshot, followed by coarse, demanding shouts. She nudged her horse, Bess, into a small thicket of mesquite and peered through the thorny branches. A large wagon was stopped in the road. Its driver, a man she did not recognize. Standing with his hands raised, two rough-looking men on horseback were menacing him, their guns drawn. Eliza's eyes scanned the scene. Taking in the details, the man was dressed too finely for this part of the country. The wagon was heavy, its contents clearly valuable. The bandits were sloppy, too focused on their prize. Her mind worked quickly, not with complex plans, but with the simple, practical logic of the frontier. Shouting was useless. A single woman with a single pistol was poor odds against two armed men. But she knew something they did not. Just over the next rise was a small herd of wild longhorns. Wiry, mean creatures left to fend for themselves, as unpredictable as a summer storm. She backed Bess away quietly, circling around the rise, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. She found the cattle grazing on the sparse, sunburnt grass. Taking a deep breath, she pulled her pistol, not to fire at the men, but into the air. The first shot sent the cattle's head snapping up. The second, combined with a wild whoop that tore from her throat, sent them into a panic. They thundered over the rise, a wave of horns and hooves and terrified muscle, aimed directly at the road. The bandits heard the stampede before they saw it. Their horses shied and whinnied. They turned just in time to see the dust cloud and the charging beasts. Forgetting the doctor and his wagon, they spurred their mounts and scattered, riding for their lives. The doctor, seeing the approaching danger, dove for the ditch. The wagon, unfortunately, was directly in the path of the panicked herd. A large steer slammed into its side, and the heavy vehicle groaned and then tipped over with a great crash of splintering wood and shattering glass. The longhorns thundered past, their passing a whirlwind of dust and noise, and then they were gone, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Eliza rode down from the rise, her pistol still in her hand. The man was climbing out of the ditch, brushing dust from his coat. He was tall and looked shaken, but unharmed. Most of his supplies, however, were strewn across the road around the overturned wagon. She stopped Bess a few feet away. She called out, her voice rough with dust. "Doctor, get your head down. The dust is thick enough to plow." He looked up, pushing his spectacles back onto his nose. He managed a small, shaky smile. He spoke with a clipped, precise accent that was utterly alien to her ears. "Thank you. Miss, your intervention was most timely and, I must say, extraordinarily inventive." Eliza stared at him. The man had nearly been shot, his wagon was in pieces, and he was speaking as if he were at a church social. A flare of irritation went through her. "Thanking a man by the book out here will get you dead of thirst," she said flatly. "Are you hurt?" He patted himself down. "A methodical inspection. I believe I am intact. My supplies, however, have fared less well." Together, they surveyed the damage. Glass jars were broken, their contents spilled into the dust, but the large medicine chest was intact, as were the heavy crates of books. The strange iron press seemed to have survived as well. It would take work, but most of it was salvageable. Back in town, the arrival of the new doctor and his wrecked wagon was the biggest event in months. Eliza explained what had happened, her account brief and unadorned, deflecting any praise. Dr. Quinn secured a room at the boarding house and, with the help of old Tom, managed to haul his belongings to a small, abandoned storefront he rented for a pittance. He was a curiosity, this man of books and strange Eastern manners. It did not take long for him to run afoul of the town's true powers. Gideon Rusk watched from the porch of his office as the doctor cleaned and organized his new clinic. He saw the crates of books and the small hand press being assembled. He turned to Sheriff Pike, who was leaning against a post, whittling a piece of wood. "What's he need a printing press for?" Harlan Rusk asked, his voice a low rumble. "Jed says he aims to print up health notices. For the good of the public, he says." Rusk grunted. "Good of the public. Most folks here can't read their own name. Who's he printing for? He's giving medicine away, too. Says he'll take what people can pay. That's bad for business." The sheriff shaved a long curl of wood from his stick. My business. You mean your company store sells a lot of patent remedies? Rusk's eyes narrowed. Our business. Maybe you should have a word with the good doctor. Explain that a man needs to pay for protection in a town like this, a sort of fee for keeping his establishment safe. Eliza was walking by, carrying a bucket of water, and she overheard the last part of their exchange. She kept her eyes down, but her ears were open. The casual greed of it, the way they spoke of the town and its people as if they were pieces on a game board, settled in her stomach like a cold stone. She despised them both, Rusk with his open arrogance and Pike with his weasel's smile. A few days later, she saw the doctor's work firsthand. A young cowboy from a neighboring ranch had been brought in, shivering and delirious with a fever. Dr. Quinn's clinic was sparse, little more than a cot, a table, and his imposing medicine chest. But it was clean. He worked with a quiet competence that was strangely calming. He diagnosed it as malaria, the swamp fever, and began administering quinine. Eliza found herself helping without being asked, fetching cool water from the well and tearing strips of cloth for compresses. The boy's fever was high, and he thrashed on the cot, muttering nonsense. The doctor worked through the night, and Eliza stayed with him, holding the boy's hand, speaking to him in low, soothing tones as her own mother once had for her. By dawn, the fever had broken. The boy was weak but lucid, sleeping peacefully. Dr. Quinn watched her for a moment, his face tired but his eyes holding a new respect. "You are very good at this, Miss Carter. You have a healer's touch." She just shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just common sense." He nodded, then reached for a small, single sheet of paper that had come from his press. The text was neat and black. "I have prepared a small guide on the prevention of fevers." He said it details the importance of clean water in controlling mosquitoes. Would you like to read it? He held the paper out to her. The black marks on the page seemed to writhe like snakes. Her heart gave a painful lurch. The words were a locked door, and behind it lay all her fear and all her shame. Her throat went dry. She could feel his gaze on her, expectant, kind. She could not bear it. She snatched the paper from his hand, not gently, but with a sudden, jerky motion. "Thank you, doctor," she mumbled, avoiding his eyes. She quickly folded the small sheet and shoved it deep into her apron pocket. It felt like a hot coal against her leg, a burning reminder of the one thing she could not do, the one wilderness she could not navigate. The next morning, a new sign stood outside Dr. Quinn's clinic. It was a simple pine board, painted white, with black letters he had carefully rendered himself. The words were plain and direct: clinic. Payment taken as you are able. No charge for children. The sign caused a stir. Women on their way to the mercantile stopped to read it, whispering to one another. Cowboys slowed their horses, squinting at the words, some with skepticism, others with a glimmer of relief. In a town where every transaction was a struggle, the offer of aid without a fixed price was a foreign and unsettling concept. Sheriff Harlan Pike saw the sign, and his mouth tightened into a thin, displeased line. He did not like things he could not control or tax. Later that day, Gideon Rusk sent for him. Rusk's office was the nicest room in Dust Haven, with a large oak desk and leather chairs that had come all the way from St. Louis. "No charge for children," Rusk repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "He is a fool, or he is a very clever man. Either way, he is a problem." Pike shrugged. "People are talking. They like him." "For now," Rusk said, swirling a bit of whiskey in a glass. "Popularity is like a summer creek. It dries up quick. I have some crates of my own remedies in the warehouse. The ones that did not sell so well. Make sure they find their way into the back rooms of the mercantile and the saloon, at a very low price. We will see how long the good doctor's charity lasts when folks can buy a bottle of guaranteed cure for 2 bits. Eliza tried to put the doctor and his offered leaflet out of her mind. The folded paper remained in her pocket, a square of shame she could not bring herself to throw away. She was sweeping the wooden sidewalk in front of the boarding house when Nina came running up to her, her dark braids flying behind her. The girl's face was alight with the discovery of a treasure. "Eliza, look what I found," she said, holding up a slightly crumpled envelope. "It must have fallen from your apron." Eliza's heart stopped. She knew that envelope. She had paid Jed, the postman's wife, a dime to write the letter inside it for her. It was to her younger brother, Daniel, who was working on a farm in Kansas. It was full of the small news of her life, translated into a script she could not decipher. Nina, sensing nothing of Eliza's panic, held it out. "You are going to send it." "Yes, before you do. Could you read it to me again? The part about the horse that thinks it is a dog? It was so funny." The world seemed to tilt. Eliza stared at the envelope, at the elegant, looping letters that spelled her brother's name. They were as meaningless to her as bird tracks in the dust. She could feel Nina's bright, curious eyes on her. To admit the truth to this girl, who devoured every scrap of print she could find, was unthinkable. "I am busy now." "Nina," Eliza said, her voice sounding stiff and strange to her own ears, "the dust is everywhere. Remind me tomorrow. We will read it then." She took the letter and shoved it into her pocket, next to the doctor's leaflet. The two papers felt like they were burning through the cloth. Nina looked disappointed but nodded and ran off to her next adventure, leaving Eliza feeling hollow and false, the broom heavy in her hands. That afternoon, another trial presented itself. Dr. Quinn found her as she was leaving the mercantile. "Miss Carter," he said, his face hopeful, "I have a favor to ask. You have such capable hands. I am trying to assemble my printing press, and the instructions are to be charitable, lacking. The diagrams are clear enough, but there are some fine points of assembly I cannot seem to manage on my own." She could not think of a polite way to refuse. She found herself in his clinic, which was beginning to look more organized, with bottles neatly arranged on shelves. The press sat in the middle of the floor, a jumble of black iron parts, gears, and levers. It looked like a complicated puzzle. The work itself was not difficult for her. She had a natural understanding of how things fit together, a mechanical grace in her fingers. She could see how a lever was meant to pivot, how a gear should mesh with its partner. She worked in silence, handing the doctor tools, holding heavy pieces in place while he tightened bolts. He spoke as he worked, explaining the function of each part. "This is the platen," he said, patting a flat plate of iron. "It presses the paper against the inked type. And this is the type case, where the individual letters are kept." He pointed to a small, engraved plate on the side of the machine. "The maker's name, I presume," he said, squinting at it. "It is a bit smudged. Can you make it out?" She leaned closer, her stomach clenching. The letters were small and ornate. H-O-E. It could have been anything. Her mind was a complete blank. She could feel a fine sheen of sweat break out on her palms. She straightened up, her face carefully neutral. "The light is poor in here," she said. "It is hard to tell." She quickly picked up another piece of the machine, a long metal handle. "Where does this belong?" She had deflected him, but the near miss left her trembling. They finished the assembly an hour later. The press stood complete, a strange and powerful machine in the heart of Dust Haven. It was a machine that ran on words, and she was an outsider to its world. They stood for a moment, admiring their work. The sun had set, and the clinic was filled with the deep blue light of twilight. The air was cooling, and through the open door came the steady, chirping song of crickets. It was a peaceful sound, a sound that usually brought her comfort. Tonight, it just made the silence between them feel heavier. The weight of the day, of the letter and the press and the years of hiding, suddenly became too much for her to bear. The secret was a stone she had carried for so long, and she did not have the strength to lift it another day. She turned to him, her face in the shadows. "I cannot read," she whispered. The words were barely a breath, but they seemed to echo in the quiet room. He did not act surprised. He did not offer pity. He simply looked at her, his expression softening with a deep and gentle understanding that seemed to reach right into her soul. He gave her a small, tired smile. "I will teach letters. You will teach me patience," he said, his voice quiet. "We will write one book together." Eliza stared at him, a knot of emotion tightening in her throat. The simplicity of his offer, the sheer, unadorned kindness of it, was more overwhelming than any judgment could have been. A strange bargain was struck in the twilight. It was an exchange, not of money, but of knowledge. She would teach him the ways of the West, the practical skills that were not found in his books. She showed him how to read the clouds, how the high, thin wisps meant wind, but the low, bruised-looking bellies meant a rare and precious rain. She taught him how to saddle a horse properly, how to distribute the weight and pull the cinch tight so it would not slip on a steep trail. She explained the unspoken rules of the saloon, how to stand, who to look at, and who to ignore, the subtle language of respect and threat that kept the peace far more than the sheriff's badge ever did. In return, he began to teach her the alphabet. Their classroom was the world. He pointed out the big B on a sack of Bull Durham tobacco, the FF on a bag of flour in the mercantile. He had her trace the letters with her finger, sounding them out. Ba, fa. The first lessons were halting and awkward. The shapes that were so distinct to him swam before her eyes, a meaningless jumble. But he was endlessly patient, just as he had promised. Their lessons were a secret, held in the quiet hours after sunset. They met in the stable behind old Tom's smithy, the air thick with the scent of hay and horses. One evening, Sheriff Pike saw the lamplight in the stable and came to investigate. He peered through a crack in the door, a smirk spreading across his face. He saw the doctor pointing to a slate and Eliza struggling to form a letter. "Well, well," Pike drawled, pushing the door open. "What have we here, the good doctor holding school?" He looked at Eliza, his eyes full of scorn. "You teach a woman to read, she is liable to forget how to cook a meal." Before Quinn could respond, a heavy blacksmith's hammer clattered against the far wall, just inches from Pike's head. Old Tom stood in the doorway of his forge, his face grim in the firelight. "Get out of here, Pike," he growled. "This is private property. Go find a pocket to pick." The sheriff glared, but there was no arguing with old Tom when he was in that mood. He backed away, muttering threats under his breath. One night, Quinn brought a piece of charcoal and cleared the top of an old wooden barrel. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, and guided her fingers as they traced the first letter of her name. E, then L, I, Z, A. She did it on her own, her hands shaking so badly the letters were wobbly and uncertain. Eliza May Carter. She stared at the words, at her name, written by her own hand for the first time in her life. A sound escaped her, a choked laugh that was half a sob. It felt as if she had just introduced herself to the world, as if the woman made of charcoal on the barrel was more real than the one who had been hiding for all these years. They sat on a bench outside the smithy as the stars began to appear. "Books are not just for city folk," Quinn said, looking up at the vast, dark sky. "Letters are the rope that leads us through the desert." Eliza thought of Rusk and Pike, of Abigail Loom's sharp eyes and the whispers in the saloon. "The desert here is people," she replied quietly. The shadows were gathering in Dusthaven, and not all of them were cast by the setting sun. Gideon Rusk's plan was put into motion. In the dead of night, one of his men crept to the town well, the one closest to the doctor's clinic, and emptied a heavy sack into the water. The fine, white powder dissolved without a trace. It was alum, a substance that would not poison anyone outright but would sour their stomachs and turn them against the well, and against the newcomer whose clinic was just a stone's throw away. The next morning, the first few people to draw water complained of a bitter taste. By noon, the rumors had started. The doctor was doing something. They said his chemicals were getting into the ground. The first seeds of doubt had been sown, and in the dry, thirsty ground of Dusthaven, they were sure to take root. The rumors about the tainted well water spread faster than a prairie fire, but Dr. Quinn's little schoolhouse grew in defiance of them. Nina, with her unquenchable thirst for knowledge, became the first student after Eliza. She saw the light in the grain shed behind the smithy one evening and simply walked in, her eyes wide. Soon, she brought 2 younger boys from a nearby ranch whose parents saw more value in a child who could read a bill of lading than one who could not. The grain shed, which had been a dusty, forgotten space, transformed. Quinn had found a large, smooth piece of cowhide and stretched it taut between 2 posts. Using charcoal, he had carefully printed the entire alphabet on it, the capital letters marching in a proud line above their smaller brethren. It was their permanent blackboard. Eliza found herself the lead student, a position that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The children learned faster, their minds supple and unafraid. Her own was a stubborn, knotted thing, full of old fears, but slowly, painstakingly, the knots began to loosen. One evening, Quinn pointed to a simple drawing of a cat on a slate. "Sound it out. Eliza," he urged gently. K-t, she said, the sounds feeling foreign in her mouth. She strung them together. Cat. Her eyes then drifted to her own name, which she had practiced writing on the same slate. Carter. The shape of the first letters. The sound they made. It was so similar. A slow smile spread across her face. Cat, Carter. She looked up at Quinn and laughed. A genuine, unrestrained sound. "I am a cat," she declared. Nina giggled. "Eliza Carter is a cat." The 2 boys erupted in laughter, and soon the whole shed was filled with the sound of their mirth. In that moment, learning was not a chore or a secret shame. It was a joyous game. The printing press was no longer a puzzle of inert iron, but a living thing with a steady, rhythmic pulse. The crank was stiff, but the machine worked. Quinn decided their first official publication of the Dust Haven Medical Bulletin would be on the 2 greatest threats to the town, the fever and the water. He laid out the text, simple declarative sentences about boiling drinking water and the benefits of quinine. The task of setting the tiny, backward lead letters into the composing stick fell to Eliza. Her fingers, nimble from years of mending tack and sewing clothes, were well suited to the delicate work, but her eyes still struggled. She would hold the letter up, comparing it to the master text Quinn had written, her lips moving silently as she sounded it out. She was setting the headline, "Beware Bad Water." She carefully picked out the letters, placing them one by one into the frame. Quinn was busy mixing a new batch of ink, a thick, dark substance that smelled of linseed oil. When she finished, he came to inspect her work. He looked at it, then looked at her, a gentle amusement in his eyes. "Almost perfect," he said. He pointed to the second word. "That is Ed, not Ab. Bad, not Bab." Eliza looked down and saw her mistake. A hot flush of embarrassment started to creep up her neck, but she pushed it down. A month ago, she would have been mortified. Now, she just shook her head and smiled wearily. "Bab water. Sounds like something a baby would say." "Let us print a few," Quinn said, a twinkle in his eye, a collector's item. "It will show people that learning is a process." He inked the type, laid a sheet of paper, and pulled the heavy lever. The first leaflet emerged, proclaiming its warning against bab water. The mistake seemed to make it less intimidating, more human. Their work, however, did not go unnoticed, nor was it universally praised. Abigail Loom arrived at the boarding house one afternoon as Eliza was changing linens. The pastor's wife was a formidable presence, her black dress as severe as her expression. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "Eliza Carter," she said, her voice sharp, "I hear you are spending your evenings in the company of the doctor, and that you are learning to read." Eliza straightened up, holding a clean pillowcase in her hands. She met the older woman's gaze without flinching. "Yes, ma'am, that is true." "A widow has duties, Mrs." Loom continued, her voice rising, minding her home, honoring the memory of her husband, and attending to the Lord. Learning letters is an indulgence. It puts notions in a woman's head. It is an invitation to idleness and worse. Eliza thought of the heavy press, the tiny pieces of type, the strain in her eyes as she tried to decipher the shapes. It was the furthest thing from idleness she had ever known, a new kind of confidence, one she had not possessed before, rose up in her. It was quiet, not defiant. "Ma'am," she said, her voice even. "So far, the letters have mostly taught me how to tell the difference between a poison and a cure. And they are teaching me when it is best to hold my tongue." Abigail Loom was so taken aback by the calm, measured response that she was momentarily speechless. She stared at Eliza, then turned on her heel and swept out of the room, leaving a charged silence in her wake. Sheriff Pike, at the urging of Gideon Rusk, chose a more direct approach. He walked into the clinic one afternoon while the press was in operation. The rhythmic clank of the machine stopped as he filled the doorway. "Doctor," he said, his voice oozing false authority, "I have had some complaints about this machine. You are running a newspaper here. That requires a license, a town printing license." Quinn wiped his inky hands on a rag. "A printing license? I have never heard of such a thing." Pike smirked. "Lots of things you have not heard of out here. Doctor, ignorance of the law is no excuse. I'm going to have to confiscate your ink until you can produce the proper permit." He reached for the open can of black ink. Just as his fingers touched the can, Nina, who had been watching from the doorway, darted away. She ran straight for the smithy. A moment later, old Tom appeared, his leather apron covered in soot, a heavy pair of tongs in one hand. Jed, the postman, drawn by the commotion, stopped his mail wagon. A small crowd began to gather on the boardwalk, their face curious. "Hold on there, Harlan," old Tom said, his voice a low growl. "You taking this man's property? You got a warrant for that, a written order from a judge?" Pike's face reddened. "I am the law here, Tom. I do not need a warrant to enforce town ordinances." "What ordinance?" Jed piped up. "I deliver the mail from Santa Fe. I have seen the territorial ordinances. There is nothing in there about a printing license." Pike looked at the crowd. He was used to intimidating people one-on-one, not being questioned in public. He was an instrument of Rusk's power, but he had no real authority of his own. Without a piece of paper to back him up, he was just a man with a badge. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the ink. "Fine," he snapped, withdrawing his hand, "but I will be looking into it. Do not think I will not." He turned and pushed his way through the crowd, which parted with a quiet murmur of satisfaction. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The days settled into a new rhythm, a blend of work and lessons, of public service and private discovery. One afternoon, Eliza was helping Quinn build a new set of shelves for his medicines. She was whittling a peg to join two boards when the knife slipped, slicing a deep, clean cut across the palm of her hand. Blood welled up instantly, startlingly red against her skin. She cried out more in surprise than in pain. Quinn was at her side in an instant. He led her to a stool, his face a mask of professional concern. "Let me see." He cleaned the wound with carbolic soap and water, his touch firm but gentle. "It is deep," he said. "It will need a few stitches." He worked with practiced efficiency, threading a fine, curved needle. As he prepared to make the first stitch, he saw her flinch. He stopped and, without thinking, lowered his head and blew softly on the cut. The cool air was a surprising relief. He made the first stitch, then the second, his movements quick and precise. She watched his face, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, he bandaged her hand expertly. Eliza looked at her neatly wrapped hand, then up at him, a playful light returning to her eyes. "Does the doctor charge for blowing on a cut, too?" He finished tying the bandage and met her gaze. "The price is one syllable," he said, his voice soft. "Just one. The real proof of his value to the town. However, was not in his kindness or his printing press, but in his medicine. The cases of malaria, which had been a constant scourge, began to decline. People who had been skeptical started to see that the doctor's quinine and his strange advice about stagnant water were actually working. They began to pay him, not with the coins they did not have, but with the bounty of their lives. A rancher's wife left a basket of fresh eggs on his doorstep. A farmer dropped off a sack of potatoes. Old Tom forged him a new set of iron shelf brackets, far stronger than the wooden ones they had been building. Gideon Rusk noticed. He noticed that the ranch hands who worked for him were no longer buying his expensive, useless patent medicines from the company store. They were going to the doctor. Every egg, every potato, every act of gratitude toward Quinn was a small act of rebellion against Rusk's control. The counterattack came in the form of whispers. Rusk and Pike could not fight Quinn with medicine or logic, so they fought him with slander. The talk started in the saloon, a low and dirty rumor that spread through the town like a sickness. It twisted the nightly lessons in the grain shed into something sordid. The doctor and the widow. They said with a wink and a nudge. He is not teaching her the alphabet, that is for certain. Eliza heard the talk from a woman at the mercantile. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her reputation was all she had. She fled the store, her face burning with shame and fury. She did not stop until she reached the clinic. Quinn was grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. "We have to stop," she said, her voice choked. "The lessons, we have to stop." He looked up, seeing the distress on her face. "What is it, Eliza? What has happened?" She told him what she had heard, the ugly words tumbling out. "They are saying things, horrible things, about us." Quinn set the pestle down and wiped his hands. He looked at her, his expression calm and steady. "Rumor is spilled ink. Eliza, you cannot put it back in the bottle. You can only clean it up with the truth. If we stop, we give the lie power. We cannot do that." His certainty was a balm to her panic. It did not erase the hurt, but it gave her the strength to endure it. A few nights later, a breakthrough occurred, one that cemented her resolve forever. She was helping him organize the medicine chest, placing bottles on the new shelves. She picked up a small, brown bottle. The label was white, the letters black and severe. For years, labels like this had been her enemies, mocking her with their secret language. But now, something was different. She looked at the letters, and they did not dance. They held still. She focused, her lips moving. Q-O-I-N-N-A. The word came out slowly. A marvel. She had read it. Then her eyes fell on the bottle next to it. Laudanum. She picked it up. She remembered a bottle like this, in the hand of a neighbor who had come to help when her husband, Tom, was in the grip of the fever. The neighbor had meant well, but he could not read either. He had poured a dose from the wrong bottle, a dose meant to quiet a cough, not fight a fever. The memory, long shrouded in the fog of grief, became sharp and painfully clear. It was not just the fever that had taken Tom. It was this. It was a world where a man could die because no one around him could read a simple word on a bottle. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and hot. They were not for herself, but for Tom, for the needless waste of his life. She looked up at Quinn, the two bottles held in her hands. "I just read the name of the thing that killed my Tom," she said, her voice thick with a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. "It was the wrong medicine, and we were all blind." Later that evening, they stood outside the clinic, the air still and heavy. The relentless wind from the south had finally died. A new breeze stirred, coming from the east, off the distant plains along the Pecos River. It carried a strange coolness, a scent of rain that had not fallen yet. Quinn looked up at the sky, where low, dark clouds were gathering like a bruise. He had been learning her language, the language of the sky and the land. "The wind has changed," he said, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "It will be a different kind of cold tonight." The cold that Dr. Quinn had predicted arrived with the darkness. But it was not the clean, crisp cold of a clear desert night. It was a damp, clinging chill that seemed to seep into the bones. Within 2 days, the sickness began. It started with the children. They were the first to feel the cramping in their bellies, the first to suffer the debilitating weakness. The well water near the clinic, once merely bitter, now ran cloudy from the bucket, carrying a fine, pale sediment. Quinn knew immediately it was dysentery. It was a filth sickness, a disease of bad water. But this was not the usual contamination from a stray animal or seepage. This felt deliberate, chemical. He suspected poison, a suspicion so dark and ugly he kept it to himself. For now. Action was the only antidote to fear. While Quinn tended to the sick children, administering boiled water and salts to fight the dehydration, Eliza took charge of the well. She had seen her father dig a filtration trench once during a wet year when the creek ran muddy. It was a simple, practical piece of frontier engineering. She gathered Nina and a few of the older, healthier boys, and they dug a long, shallow channel leading away from the well. They filled it with layers of gravel and clean sand hauled from a dry riverbed miles away. It was backbreaking work under the strange, heavy sky. As they worked, Eliza explained the principle. The water would seep through the layers, leaving the filth behind. It was a slow process, but it would yield clean water at the other end. As they finished the trench, the sky, which had been threatening for a day, finally broke. But it was not the gentle, life-giving rain the town had prayed for. It was a hard, violent assault. Hailstones, some as large as pigeon eggs, hammered the dusty ground, punching holes in canvas wagon covers and sending chickens scattering for their lives. The noise was deafening, a relentless roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings. The hailstorm was followed by a torrential downpour, a deluge the likes of which Dust Haven had not seen in a decade. The parched ground could not absorb the sudden flood. Water sheeted across the land, turning the main street into a muddy, raging river. The old wooden bridge at the edge of town, its timbers weakened by years of dry rot, was no match for the flash flood. With a great groaning tear of wood, it collapsed into the churning brown water. Just as it fell, a small covered wagon, caught unawares by the storm, was trying to cross. The wagon's front wheels plunged into the new chasm, and the vehicle tipped violently, held from being swept away only by the terrified strength of its 2 horses, who scrabbled for purchase on the muddy bank. Quinn and Eliza saw it happen from the doorway of the clinic. Without a word, they ran into the storm. The rain plastered their hair to their faces and soaked their clothes in seconds. Quinn grabbed a coil of thick rope from his wagon, and Eliza, moving with the sure-footed instinct of a lifetime spent outdoors, found a path along the less steep part of the bank. A man and his wife were inside the wagon, their face pale with terror. Quinn and Eliza worked as a single unit, their movements economical and precise. Eliza calmed the horses, her voice a low, steady murmur that cut through the roar of the water. Quinn, with his knowledge of knots, secured one end of the rope to the wagon's axle and the other to the thick trunk of a cottonwood tree. It was a desperate anchor against the current. "Help us!" the woman inside cried, her voice thin with panic. "One at a time!" Quinn shouted over the storm. "Eliza, guide them!" Eliza waded into the thigh-deep water, the current pulling at her skirts. She braced herself against the side of the wagon and extended a hand. The woman came first, then the man, their movements clumsy with fear. Eliza led them to the bank, her grip firm and reassuring. With the people safe, they turned back to the wagon. It was full of the family's possessions, everything they owned in the world. They could not save it all, but they could try, working together. They managed to unhitch the panicked horses and lead them to safety. Then, with the rope straining, they salvaged what they could before the current finally tore the wagon from its precarious perch and sent it tumbling down the new river. While the storm raged, Nina had taken shelter in the lee of the town's large water cistern, a stone structure that collected the rare rainwater. As she huddled there, She saw a figure moving through the sheets of rain. It was one of Gideon Rusk's men, a surly cowboy named Finch. He was carrying a heavy sack and moving furtively, looking over his shoulder. Nina pressed herself into the shadows. She watched as Finch climbed the ladder to the top of the cistern, opened the hatch, and emptied the contents of the sack into the town's precious reserve of clean water. The powder was grayish, and it dissolved quickly in the churning water. Finch started back down the ladder. As his boots hit the ground, he saw her. His eyes widened, first in surprise, then in anger. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "What did you see? You little brat," he snarled. Nina struggled, but he was too strong. "I saw you," she cried, her voice a mix of fear and defiance. "I saw you poison the water." He clamped a hand over her mouth. "You saw nothing? That was a gift from Mr. Rusk. Water purifier, to help with the sickness." It was a clumsy lie, and Nina knew it. She bit his hand, hard. He yelped and loosened his grip for a second, just long enough for her to squirm free. She ran, her bare feet slipping in the mud, not looking back. She did not stop until she burst into the clinic, where Quinn and Eliza were helping the rescued couple dry themselves by the small stove. The rain finally subsided by late afternoon, leaving a world washed clean but deeply wounded, armed with Nina's story and a jar of the cloudy water from the well. Quinn walked directly to the sheriff's office. Rusk was already there, sitting in the office's only comfortable chair, looking perfectly dry and composed. "Sheriff," Quinn said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I have evidence that your well and the town cistern have been deliberately poisoned. Nina saw one of Mr. Rusk's men do it." Pike looked from Quinn to Rusk, a slow, lazy smile spreading across his face. "Is that a fact?" He glanced at Nina, who was standing just behind Quinn. "A little girl's story, against the word of a respected citizen like Mr. Rusk." "It is not just her story," Quinn insisted. "I have a sample of the water. It contains alum. It is what is making the children sick. You are creating a panic to discredit my clinic and sell Rusk's worthless medicines." Rusk chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Doctor, you have a vivid imagination. You show up in town, and suddenly we have a plague. You print these little papers of yours, telling everyone the water is bad. Sounds to me like you are the one causing a panic." "That is exactly what it sounds like," Pike said, standing up. He walked around his desk and stood in front of Quinn. "Dr. Samuel Quinn, I am placing you under arrest for willfully inciting public alarm and endangering the peace of this town." Eliza, who had followed them, pushed her way into the office. "Arrest him. He is the one trying to help people." "He is a troublemaker," Pike said, grabbing Quinn's arm. Eliza's voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the tense silence of the room. "Are you putting words in jail, Sheriff, or are you jailing the only man who is trying to keep this town from dying of thirst and ignorance?" Pike ignored her. He shoved Quinn toward the town's single jail cell and slammed the barred door shut. The town was now split down the middle. One half, the people who had been treated by Quinn, the families whose children he had saved from fever, the couple he had pulled from the floodwaters. They gathered in front of the sheriff's office, their voices a low murmur of protest. The other half, swayed by years of Rusk's influence and their own deep-seated fears, kept their distance. Abigail Loom saw her opportunity to reassert her moral authority. She stood on the steps of the church and preached to a small but receptive crowd. "This is a sign from the Almighty," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with conviction. "A punishment for our vanities. When women forsake their proper place and take up books, they invite chaos into our homes. This sickness is not from the well. It is from the sin of a woman trying to be a man." Reverend Loom stood beside her, his face a portrait of conflicted misery. He did not believe his wife's words, but he did not have the strength to contradict her in public. His silence was a form of consent, and it lent a terrible weight to her accusations. Amid the chaos, Eliza felt a strange calm settle over her. She saw the faces in the crowd, the fear, the confusion. She knew what she had to do. She walked back to the clinic, where she had been working on a new leaflet with Quinn before the storm. It was about the dysentery outbreak. She had set the type for the headline herself. Clean water. The lungs of the town. She had misspelled lungs. Writing lungs. But Quinn had insisted they print it that way. Let them see you are learning. He had said, it is more honest. She took a stack of the leaflets. She walked to the center of the crowd gathered before the jail, climbed onto an empty wagon bed, and held one of the papers up for all to see. For a moment, she was frozen by the old fear. She could feel her father's angry gaze, could hear his voice berating her for a misspoken word. Her hands trembled. Then she looked at the jail, at Quinn's face visible between the bars. She took a deep breath. My name is Eliza May Carter, she said, her voice shaking at first, then growing stronger. I cannot read as well as some, but I am learning, and I can read this. She began to read the simple, clear instructions on the leaflet, her voice ringing out over the crowd. Boil all your water. Do not drink from the well until it is cleaned. Wash your hands. Each word was a victory, a stone laid in the foundation of a new life. She was no longer hiding. She was speaking the truth in a town that was drowning in lies. That night, after the crowd had dispersed and a tense quiet had fallen over the town, Eliza found a moment of peace. She sat with Quinn in the sheriff's office, the lawman having gone to the saloon. They were separated by the bars of his cell. They were both exhausted, their clothes still damp, their bodies aching from the day's labors. A small pot-belly stove in the corner of the office offered a meager warmth against the lingering chill. She was shivering, as much from reaction as from the cold. He watched her from his cell. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. Thank you, Eliza, for what you did today. She just nodded, unable to speak. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling. Without a word, he reached through the bars and rested his hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm and steady. She leaned into it, just slightly, drawing strength from the simple human contact. In Dust Haven, she said, her voice barely a whisper, the warmest thing is trusting each other. The next morning, Sheriff Pike announced that Dr. Quinn would be given a public trial. The charge was causing a public nuisance and inciting panic. The trial was set for the following day. It was not to be a trial of facts, but a spectacle designed to crush the seeds of change the doctor had planted. Eliza knew it. As she left the sheriff's office, her resolve hardened into steel. They wanted a spectacle. She would give them one. I will read them the truth. She vowed to herself, I will read it so loud they can no longer pretend to be deaf. The rain had returned with the evening, a soft, persistent drumming on the roof of old Tom's smithy. It was a sound that should have been comforting, a promise of life in the parched land. But tonight it only seemed to enclose Eliza in her own fear. After the confrontation in town, old Tom had marched to the sheriff's office and paid Quinn's bond with a pouch of silver dollars he had been saving for a new anvil, his face set in a stubborn glower that dared Pike to refuse. Quinn was free. For now. But the trial loomed, a shadow that stretched over the entire town. Eliza had sought refuge in the stable, the place where her education had begun. The air was thick with the familiar, calming scents of dry hay, old leather, and horse. A single lantern cast a pool of flickering golden light, making the shadows in the corners dance. In her hands, she held a heavy, leather-bound book she had borrowed from the Reverend's small collection. A Bible. Its pages were filled with a dense forest of words, a terrifying, impenetrable wilderness she had promised to navigate in front of the entire town. Her hands trembled so violently the book shook with them. She had tried to find a passage, any passage, to practice reading for the trial, but the letters swam before her eyes, mocking her. Her brief moment of courage on the wagon bed had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, familiar dread. She did not hear him approach, but she felt a change in the air, a steady presence that was not one of the horses. She looked up and saw Dr. Quinn standing just inside the stable door. His shoulders slumped with weariness, his face pale in the lantern light. He had come looking for her. He said nothing at first, just watched her, his gaze taking in the shaking book and the desperation on her face. He walked slowly toward her and sat on the hay bale beside her. The scent of rain and clean linen clung to him. "What are you doing, Eliza?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. "Practicing for the trial," she answered, her own voice a strained whisper. "I told them I would read. I have to, but the words, they will not stand still. There are so many of them." She looked down at the page, at the columns of impossibly small print. The weight of her promise, of all those expectant and hostile faces, pressed down on her until she felt she could not breathe. All the progress she had made, all the small victories with flour sacks and medicine bottles, felt like a child's game in the face of this immense, unyielding book. The secret she had guarded for a lifetime, the one she had briefly thought herself free of, came rushing back, a cold tide of shame. She closed the book with a snap, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet stable. The trembling in her hands worsened. She turned her face to him, the lantern light catching the glint of unshed tears in her eyes. "I can't read," she whispered. The confession was a surrender, an admission of the terrible, fundamental truth she had been running from. "Not really. Not like this. I will stand up there tomorrow, and I will be a fool. I will shame us both." He did not look away. He did not offer empty reassurances. A slow, deeply compassionate smile touched his lips, a smile that held no judgment, only a vast and patient understanding. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to hold the space between them with his quiet strength. "I will teach letters. You will teach me patience," he said, his voice as soft as the rain on the roof. "We will write one book together." Eliza stared at him, the meaning of his words slowly seeping into her. One book. Together. It was not an offer of tutoring. It was an offer of partnership. "What do you mean?" she asked, her whisper full of a fragile, burgeoning hope. "This," he said, gesturing with his head toward the dark town beyond the stable door. "This place. It is full of knowledge, but none of it is written down. You know how to find water, how to treat a snake bite with herbs, how to read a cattle brand from 100 yards. I know what is in my medical texts. My knowledge is useless if no one can read it. Your knowledge dies with you if it is never recorded." He leaned forward, his eyes earnest and bright. "We will make a book for Dust Haven, not a book of sermons or laws from a faraway capital, but a book of our own, a handbook for survival. We will print it on our press, a few pages at a time, and give it to everyone. We will record old Tom's method for tempering steel, and your way of making poultices. We will map the stars for travelers and explain the signs of fever. We will create a book that belongs to everyone, that speaks in a language they can understand, your knowledge and mine, together." The idea was so bold, so simple, so utterly right, that it took her breath away. It was not about her shame or his education. It was about building something new, something that would protect and sustain the community they had both come to care for. He gently took the heavy Bible from her trembling hands and set it aside. He then picked up a small, worn primer that they had been using for her lessons. He opened it to a simple page. "Let us start with tonight," he said. "Not for the trial, not for them, for us, for our book." He moved closer on the hay bale, so their shoulders were almost touching. He held the small book in the pool of lantern light. He did not point to the words. Instead, he laid his index finger on the page, just beneath the first line, ready to guide her eye. His hand was steady, his presence a warm and solid anchor in her sea of fear. She could feel the heat of his arm next to hers, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. She took a shaky breath and looked down at the page. Her voice was hesitant at first, a mere thread of sound. She stumbled over a word, and his finger paused, waiting patiently until she found her way. He did not correct her. He simply waited, his silent support more helpful than any instruction. She read a line, then another. Her voice grew stronger, clearer. They were just simple words about a boy and his dog, but as she spoke them aloud in the quiet intimacy of the stable, they felt like the most important words in the world. When she finished the page, she looked up at him. His face was very close to hers, his expression soft and encouraging. A playful light entered her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. "If you teach me how to tie a knot that will hold a wild steer," she said, her voice teasing, "I promise I can teach you to write an R that does not look like a trembling snake." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Your letters can tremble all they want, Doctor, so long as your heart stays steady." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. It was small and heavy, and it glinted in the lantern light. It was one of the lead-type letters from the press. He had drilled a small hole through it and threaded it onto a simple leather thong. He held it out to her. It was the letter E. "This is your name," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do not be afraid of it." She took it from him, the cool, solid metal a comforting weight in her palm. It was more than just a piece of lead. It was a symbol of her identity, a name she was finally learning to claim as her own. She looped the leather thong around her neck, the metal E coming to rest against her collarbone. "So," he said, breaking the gentle silence, "the Dust Haven Health and Survival Handbook. What shall our first chapter be?" "Clean water," she answered without hesitation. "We will explain, in the simplest words we can find, why it is the most important thing. We will make it so clear that even a child can understand. We will print 100 copies and put one in every hand in this town. For free. We will write to protect the weak," Quinn affirmed, his eyes locking with hers. "Not to show off how much we know. And to fight the powerful with the truth," she added, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction. Just then, the rain outside began to soften, the angry drumming on the roof gentling to a soft patter. A deep, contented sigh came from one of the horse stalls, followed by a loud, comical sneeze that broke the spell of the moment. They both looked toward the sound and then at each other. A smile started on Eliza's lips, and an answering one on Quinn's. A moment later, they were both laughing. It was not a loud, boisterous sound, but a quiet, shared bubble of joy and relief that seemed to fill the entire stable. The rain stopped. Outside, the air smelled clean and new, washed of its dust and its fear. In the quiet that followed, a bond was forged between them, a connection made not of whispered passions or grand declarations, but of shared laughter, quiet trust, and the simple, powerful promise of a book they would write together. The night of the trial was stolen before it could dawn. A new and terrible light bloomed in the darkness, an angry orange that painted the undersides of the low clouds. The smell came first, the acrid scent of burning hay, followed by the sound, a hungry hiss and crackle that was far more terrifying than the loudest thunder. The grain shed, their small schoolhouse, their sanctuary of letters, was on fire. Flames licked up the dry timber walls, consuming the heart of their fragile new enterprise. The whole town awoke to the shouting and the lurid glow. Men formed a bucket brigade from the nearest clean well, their efforts a desperate, futile gesture against the inferno. The fire was too hot, too fast. It had been given a head start, fed by something more than just dry wood. Dr. Quinn and Eliza arrived to see the roof collapsing inward, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. And through the chaos, Sheriff Harlan Pike strode with a grim and purposeful air. He went straight for Quinn, his face illuminated by the firelight, a mask of false righteousness. "This is your doing, Doctor!" Pike bellowed, his voice carrying over the roar of the flames. "You and your books and your troublemaking. You riled people up, and now look, you brought this chaos to our town." He did not wait for a reply. He and two of his cronies, men who drew their pay from Gideon Rusk, seized Quinn. They bound his hands behind his back with a rough piece of rope, in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Rusk himself stood watching, a faint, satisfied smile playing on his lips. By morning, the shed was a blackened, smoking skeleton. The trial was not to be held in the sheriff's office, but in the open, in the center of the town square. It was to be a public spectacle. Quinn was tied to the central hitching post, a prisoner in the heart of the town he had tried to save. A crowd gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and a rising, ugly anger. They were a flock without a shepherd, and Abigail Loom was more than willing to take up the crook. She stood on the steps of the mercantile, her voice a shrill instrument of judgment. "I warned you," she cried, pointing a long, bony finger first at Quinn, then toward Eliza, who stood at the edge of the crowd. "I warned you what happens when the natural order is disturbed. The Lord sends fire to cleanse the unrighteous. A woman learning the words of men brings a curse. This fire is a judgment on her pride, and on the man who encouraged it." The crowd murmured, the poison of her words seeping into their fear. They were tired and scared. They had faced sickness, flood, and now fire. They needed someone to blame, and the two outsiders made for an easy target. Eliza felt the weight of their stares, the heat of their suspicion. The old fear, the one that had held her captive for so long, coiled in her stomach. But as she looked at Quinn, standing tall and defiant, even with his hands bound, and as she touched the small, solid weight of the letter E hanging at her neck, a different feeling rose to meet the fear. It was a cold, clear anger. They would not be silenced by lies. She pushed her way through the crowd. She held no book, no slate. In her hand was a single, slightly wrinkled leaflet from the printing press. She stepped onto the same wagon bed where she had read once before. Her hands were shaking. Her voice, when it first came, was a reedy whisper. "There is a sickness in this town," she began, her voice trembling. "But it is not a curse from God. It is a poison in our water." She held up the leaflet. She forced herself to look at the words, to see them not as enemies, but as tools, as weapons. Her voice grew stronger, steadier with each syllable. She read the simple sentences about boiling water and filtering filth. Each word she spoke was a blow against the chaos, a small, clear note of truth in a symphony of fear. Each letter was a step she took out of the desert of her childhood and into the open plain of her own life. When she finished, a tense silence held the crowd. Before anyone could speak, a small figure darted through the legs of the adults. It was Nina. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide and fierce. She was holding a small glass jar containing a whitish powder. "This is what he used," she cried, her voice high and clear. She pointed a trembling finger at Finch. "Rusk's man, who was standing near the sheriff. I saw him. He put this in the cistern, and he set the fire." Finch paled. "That is a lie." "It is no lie," a new voice boomed. Old Tom stepped forward, his face grim. In his hand, he held the splintered piece of the shed's door latch. He pointed to a deep gouge in the wood. "I made the hammer that Finch carries. I know my own mark. This door was pried open with it." Sheriff Pike, seeing the mood of the crowd begin to shift, played his final, dirtiest card. He pulled a thick ledger book from a saddlebag. "Even if what they say is true, this man is no saint. This is his account book. It shows he is nothing but a swindler, charging poor folks for his so-called medicine. He is in debt up to his eyeballs back east." He held the book open for all to see. It was filled with columns of names and numbers. A year ago, it would have been an impenetrable wall of symbols to Eliza. But now, it was just another page to be read. She jumped down from the wagon and snatched the book from Pike's hands before he could react. She scanned the pages, her heart pounding. The lessons with Quinn had not just been about letters. They had practiced numbers, the simple symbols used for dates and prices in the mercantile. Her eyes moved quickly. A name, a date, an amount. Then she saw it, a flicker of wrongness. "This is a fake," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. She held the book up, her finger tracing a line. Look, it says here he treated Jedediah Brown on the 10th of the month, and here, on the very next page, he treated him again on the 10th, and again. The same names, the same dates, repeated over and over. You did not even have the sense to lie properly. A wave of understanding rippled through the crowd. They had been played for fools. The rage that had been directed at Quinn now turned, hot and sharp, toward Pike and Rusk. Rusk's men, seeing their power evaporate, did the only thing they knew how to do. They drew their pistols. The afternoon was shattered by the crack of a gunshot. People screamed and scattered. Quinn, still tied to the post, threw himself to the ground, dodging a bullet that splintered the wood where his head had been. In that instant of chaos, Eliza did not run for cover. She ran for the church. She grabbed the thick, frayed bell rope and pulled with all her might. The great bronze bell in the steeple, silent for so long, began to ring, its deep resonant peals rolling across the town. A frantic alarm, a call to arms. Doors flew open. Men and women, hearing the emergency summons, poured into the square. No longer a confused mob, but a community under attack. The tide had turned completely. From the church steps, a new voice spoke, filled with a sudden, unexpected strength. It was Reverend Loom. His face was ashen, but his voice was clear and firm. "The Lord loves the truth," he declared, his eyes fixed on his wife. Abigail Loom flinched as if struck, her face crumbling as the foundation of her righteous certainty was swept away. At that moment, Jed the postman came running from his office, waving a piece of paper. I knew I remembered it. He shouted, "Here it is, the freight manifest from last week's mail run. 1 crate of powdered alum, addressed to Mr. Gideon Rusk." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The lie was utterly exposed. Sheriff Pike, his face a mask of panicked fury, raised his pistol to fire into the crowd, to create a path for his escape. Before he could pull the trigger, a blacksmith's hammer, thrown with incredible accuracy, slammed into his wrist. He screamed, and the gun clattered to the dusty ground. Old Tom stood 20 feet away, his one good hand still in the throwing motion. Rusk, seeing it was all over, made a run for his horse. He managed to get into the saddle and spurred the animal hard, charging out of the square and down the track leading out of town, but his escape was cut short. From over a rise, a small herd of wild longhorns, the same herd Eliza had used weeks ago, came thundering toward the road, spooked by the ringing bell and the gunshots. Rusk's horse reared in terror, throwing him to the ground directly in their path. The cattle, a force of blind, natural justice, swept over him and were gone. In the square, the fight was over. Rusk's men threw down their guns as the townspeople surrounded them. But Quinn and Eliza were no longer paying attention to the villains. Their eyes were fixed on the still smoking ruins of the grain shed. "The books," Quinn said, his voice raw. Without another word, they ran toward the fire. The main structure was gone, but the heat at the center was still intense. They plunged into the smoke, ignoring the protests of the onlookers. They pulled out what they could, a half-burned crate of medical texts, a stack of scorched leaflets, and then Eliza saw it, lying on the edge of the fire, miraculously untouched by the worst of the flames. It was the large sheet of cowhide, their alphabet, the foundation of everything they had started. The letters, A to Z, were still there, dark and clear against the pale leather. Together, they dragged it from the ashes, pulling it free just as the last standing wall collapsed. They stood there, covered in soot, their faces streaked with grime, coughing in the smoky air. They had not saved the building, but they had saved the words. They had saved the soul of their small, battered town from the fire. In the stunned quiet that followed the chaos, Dust Haven began to breathe again. Gideon Rusk, bruised and battered but alive, was brought back to town not by a lawman, but by a committee of grim-faced ranchers who had seen his treachery firsthand. They used his own silk kerchief to bind his wrists. The town council, a body that had long been a rubber stamp for Rusk's interests, convened an emergency meeting in the street by a unanimous show of hands. They suspended Sheriff Harlan Pike from his duties, pending the arrival of a territorial marshal. In his place, they did something unprecedented. They elected a rotating night watch, with old Tom, his hammer now a symbol of civic duty, as its first captain. It was a clumsy, makeshift form of justice, but it was their own. The next morning, a tentative peace settled over the town, as if after a long fever, as Eliza and Dr. Quinn were sifting through the salvaged items from the fire. A figure appeared at the far end of the street. It was Abigail Loom. She walked with a stiff, pained dignity, her eyes fixed on the ground. She did not approach them directly. Instead, she walked to the door of the clinic, which had been left ajar, and placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on the doorstep. She hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked away without a word. When Eliza went to see what it was, she found a freshly baked loaf of bread, still warm. Tucked into the folds of the cloth was a small, torn piece of paper. On it, in a shaky, spidery script, were 3 words. For the children. It was not an apology, not to them, but it was a crack in the fortress of her certainty, a quiet admission that the world was more complicated than her sermons allowed. Eliza left the bread on the table, a silent testament to a truth she was not yet ready to accept, but was willing to acknowledge. The work of healing began, not with bodies, but with paper. In the sunlit space behind the smithy, Eliza, Quinn, and Nina carefully laid out the rescued leaflets and the scorched pages of the medical books. The water from the fire hoses had smeared the ink, and many pages were fused together. They worked for hours, gently peeling them apart, trying to salvage every precious word. Their movements were slow and tender, as if they were tending to the wounded. As they worked, old Tom was busy at a workbench nearby. The sound of his carving was a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to their quiet labor. By the end of the day, a new sign was ready. He had hewn it from a thick slab of cottonwood. The letters were carved deep in clear Dust Haven Clinic and Print Shop. He hung it above the clinic door, a bold declaration of their new, combined purpose. A few days later, as the town was finding its new footing, Eliza was sorting through a small wooden chest that held the few possessions she had kept from her marriage to Tom. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small bundle of letters. They were from him, sent during a cattle drive to Texas 2 years before his death. She had never been able to read them. A neighbor had read the first one aloud to her, but his voice had felt like an intrusion, a violation of something deeply private. She had locked the rest away, their secrets sealed. She took one of the letters to the clinic that evening. Quinn was there, cleaning the type from the press, his hands stained with ink. She stood in the doorway, the letter held in her hand like a fragile bird. "Samuel," she said, her voice quiet, "could you help me?" He looked up, saw the letter, and understood immediately. He wiped his hands and came to sit with her at the small table he used for a desk. He did not take the letter from her. He simply sat beside her, waiting. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was rough and looping, the letters formed by a hand more comfortable with a rope than a pen. She stared at it, her heart pounding. This was not a primer. This was a piece of her own life, a voice she thought she had lost forever. She began to read, her voice a whisper. She stumbled on a word, and Quinn would gently pronounce it for her. He did not explain. He just gave her the sound, letting her find the meaning herself. The letter was full of the simple, unadorned news of the trail, the price of cattle in Abilene, a thunderstorm that had spooked the herd, his longing for a decent meal, and then, at the end, were the words she had longed and feared to see. "My dearest Eliza," she read, the tears starting to well in her eyes. "The nights are long, but I think of you. I will be home soon. Your Tom." She finished, and the tears came freely then. Not tears of fresh grief, but of release. She cried for the man she had lost, but also for the woman she had been, a woman trapped in a world of silence. When the tears subsided, a profound sense of peace settled over her. The letter was no longer a symbol of her failure. It was a memory, and now, finally, it was hers. She owned her own past. The next week, the press in the newly christened print shop began to run. They worked together. A small, efficient team. Quinn wrote the text, his language clear and direct. Eliza set the type, her fingers now moving with a confident speed. Nina helped with the inking and the feeding of the paper. Their first publication was a slim, 8-page booklet. The cover read, The Dust Haven Health and Survival Handbook, Part 1, by Eliza Carter and Samuel Quinn. It was a marvel of practicality. It had a section on filtering and boiling water, with a simple diagram that even a non-reader could understand. It explained the symptoms of malaria and the proper dosage of quinine. It had a chapter, written mostly by Eliza, on how to tie 3 essential knots, with drawings to guide the hand. And at the end, there was a simple star chart of the night sky, showing how to find the North Star. They printed 200 copies. They did not sell them. They gave them away. 1 to every family in Dust Haven and the surrounding ranches. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a long day of printing, Eliza was melting down some old, broken pieces of lead type in one of old Tom's ladles. She had an idea. She had carved a small mold into a piece of wood. She carefully poured the molten lead into the carving. When it cooled, she pulled out a small, rough but recognizable letter Q. She polished it and drilled a hole through it, just as Quinn had done for her. She presented it to him on a leather thong, a companion to the E she wore every day. He took it without a word, his eyes saying more than any speech could, and looped it around his neck. The changes in Dust Haven were not loud or dramatic, but they were real. Children who came into the mercantile with their mothers would sound out the letters on the price signs. Old Tom, who had always done business with a handshake, began to write out simple receipts for his work. The evening lessons started again, this time in the back room of the church, with Reverend Loom's quiet blessing. The class was larger now. It included a few Mexican ranch hands and 2 Tiwa women who had come to trust the doctor and the widow. The lines of race and language, once so rigid, had begun to soften. But the scars remained. A few of the larger ranchers grumbled that a literate cowboy was a distracted cowboy, more likely to be reading than watching the herd. The whispers about the doctor and the widow had not entirely disappeared, though they were quieter now, laced with a grudging respect. The town was better, but it was not perfect. The wind still carried dust, and the drought had not broken. One night, they stood on the small porch behind the clinic, looking up at the vast, star-filled sky. The air was cool and clean. The first edition of their handbook was gone, every copy distributed. The press was clean and ready for the next run. "We will have to write the next one soon," Quinn said, his voice thoughtful. "A chapter on setting broken bones, perhaps, and one on preserving food." Eliza smiled, a slow, easy smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She touched the letter E at her throat. The future no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a blank page. "Life is long, Samuel," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable confidence. "The letters will not run away." The love that grew between Eliza and Samuel was not a sudden prairie fire, but a slow, steady spring seeping up from dry ground. It was a thing of trust and patience, nurtured in the quiet hours over smudged ink and difficult words. It was not born of grand passions, but of small, steady acts of faith, his hand guiding hers as she formed a letter, her voice calming a spooked horse. The shared silence of 2 weary people finding solace in each other's presence. The justice that had been born in the town square was much the same. It was not the clean, swift justice of a marshal's gun, but the messy, hard-won consensus of a community that had been forced to open its eyes. The words on the leaflets, read aloud in a trembling but determined voice, had been more powerful than any bullet. for they had illuminated the truth, and in that light, the shadows of greed and corruption had nowhere to hide. The old prejudices, once as solid and unyielding as the desert rock, had begun to fracture. The notion of a woman reading, once whispered as a sign of moral decay, was now seen for what it was: a tool for survival. A week after the fire, one of the ranchers who had been most vocal in his disapproval of Eliza's lessons came to the clinic. His wife was ill, and he held a bottle of medicine from a traveling salesman. He stood before Eliza, his hat in his hands, his face a mixture of desperation and embarrassment. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his eyes on the floor, "the salesman gave me this. He said it was for a woman's trouble, but I cannot make heads or tails of these instructions." Eliza took the bottle. The label was a mess of fine print and grand claims. She read it slowly, her finger tracing the words. It was mostly sugar water and alcohol. She looked at the man. "This will not help her," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let the doctor see her, and next time, bring the bottle to me before you buy it." The man nodded, his gratitude warring with his shame, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a widow or a woman out of her place, but as a person who possessed a skill he desperately needed. The old order had not just been challenged, it had been proven obsolete by simple, practical fact. The symbols of their struggle had become a part of the town's new language. The small, heavy lead letters Eliza and Samuel wore around their necks were no longer just pieces of type. Her E was a quiet declaration of her own name, her own mind, a thing she had wrestled from the silence. His Q was a mark of his commitment, not just to her, but to this place, a sign that he had found a home far from the ordered world he had left behind. They were their own brands, marking them not as property, but as partners. The printing press, once a strange iron beast, was now the town's voice. It sat in the front window of the clinic, a silent promise that secrets could no longer fester in the dark. Its rhythmic clank and pull was the new heartbeat of Dust Haven, a sound of creation and communication. Even the memory of the disasters had been transformed. They spoke of the fire and the flood not as curses, but as trials. The fire had been a crucible, burning away the rot of the old power structure, leaving behind a stronger, more resilient community. The rain, though destructive, had been a baptism, washing away the dust and the lies. And in the aftermath, the bell in the church steeple rang with a new meaning. It was not just a call to worship or an alarm for danger. It was a summons, a reminder that they were all tied together, their fates intertwined like the strands of the thick bell rope. The wild longhorns, once a symbol of the untamable and dangerous frontier, were now spoken of with a certain wry affection. They were a force of nature, impartial and unpredictable, a wild justice that had, in its own way, restored a kind of balance to the town. The rhythm of their lives had found a new, steadier cadence. The frantic, desperate pace of survival had been replaced by the slower, more deliberate rhythm of building. The days were still long and hard, filled with the demands of medicine and the meticulous work of the press, but the nights were quiet and reflective. The story of Dust Haven was a story of escalation, of a simmering pot that had boiled over into a fury of flood and fire and violence. Now, in the aftermath, a deep and profound quiet had settled, the quiet of healing, of things being carefully and deliberately put back together. Their conversations were a part of this rebuilding. The style between them was an easy mix of the practical and the poetic, the language of his books tempered by the plain-spoken truths of her world. The dialogue was often spare, punctuated by comfortable silences, but it was frequently lit by a spark of dry wit that served as a release valve for the pressures they still faced. One evening, as he was trying to adjust a finicky gear on the press, Samuel sighed in frustration. In Philadelphia, he said, if a machine was broken, you sent for a specialist. Here, you just stare at it until you figure it out. Eliza, who was sorting newly cast type into the case, looked up with a small smile. Or you ask it nicely. Things out here have feelings, especially horses and printing presses. His frustration broke, and he laughed. You have taught me a great deal, Eliza Carter, but the greatest lesson has been in the virtue of not forcing things. This whole country runs on a different clock. It resists being hurried. She had felt the change in him. The stiff, bookish doctor who had arrived in a dusty wagon had learned to bend. His knowledge was still vast, but it was now tempered with a humility born of facing problems that had no easy answers in his texts. He had learned the patience of the desert, the understanding that some things, like a stubborn gear or a traumatized patient, required not force, but time and a gentle touch. Her own transformation was just as profound. The fear of words, a ghost that had haunted her for her entire life, had been banished. She moved through the world of print with a growing confidence, the terror replaced by a quiet and profound joy. She read not just the simple primers, but the dense medical texts, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sounded out complex anatomical terms. She had conquered her own internal wilderness, and in doing so, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. They were a partnership forged in the twin crucibles of social and natural conflict. They had stood against the institutional rot of a corrupt sheriff and the unchecked greed of a cattle baron. But they had also stood against the impersonal fury of a flash flood and the slow, grinding misery of a drought. The two forces had been intertwined, the drought making people desperate and fearful, and that fear making them vulnerable to the manipulations of men like Rusk. They had weathered both storms, the human and the elemental, and the bond between them, and between the townspeople who had stood with them, had been tempered into something unbreakable. The small printing press was the fulcrum of this new world. It was a simple piece of technology, but in a place starved for reliable information. It was a revolution. Before, news had been a thing of rumor, of whispers in the saloon and gossip over a fence line. It was a tool of control, easily manipulated by those in power. Now, truth was something that could be held in the hand. It could be shared, debated, and preserved. The press had broken the monopoly of rumor, and in doing so, had given the power of the word back to the community. The tone of the town had shifted. It was still a hard place, full of grit and dust and the constant, wearying work of survival. There were still tragedies, a broken leg that would not heal properly, a crop that failed, a winter that was too cold. But the undercurrent of despair had been replaced by a quiet hum of hope. There was a sense of shared purpose now, a belief that they were not just enduring their hardships, but building something better in spite of them. There was laughter in the evenings, the sound of a fiddle from the saloon, the sight of children sitting on a porch, one of them slowly, proudly reading a page from the handbook to the others. The story of Dust Haven was a sad song, but it was being sung in a major key. The deceptive calm that had settled over Dust Haven lasted for a month, a long, deep breath of peace that allowed the town to heal its wounds and find its new rhythm. Then, one hot afternoon, the stage from Santa Fe brought a new kind of trouble, a kind that did not carry a gun, but a briefcase. Two men stepped out, dressed in tailored suits and polished boots that seemed to repel the dust by sheer force of will. They were agents from the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, and they moved with the smooth, predatory confidence of men who believed the world was a map, and they were destined to draw the lines on it. They said they had come with an offer, a chance for the people of Dust Haven to sell their parched, worthless land for a fair price and move on to more prosperous territories. It was a generous offer. They explained in a town meeting, a benevolent gesture from a company that was building the future. The town was divided. The memory of the drought was long, and the promise of cash in hand was a powerful temptation. The truth behind their sudden interest came from the territorial jail, where Gideon Rusk was awaiting trial. In a desperate bid for a lighter sentence, he had traded his last and most valuable secret, a hand-drawn map, passed down from his grandfather, showing the location of a deep and reliable aquifer, a subterranean river flowing directly beneath the town. Dust Haven was not sitting on a worthless patch of desert. It was sitting on a priceless, inexhaustible source of water, the single most valuable commodity in the West, and the perfect location for a railway water depot and a new, company-owned town. The railroad agents needed the land, but they wanted it cheap. Their strategy was simple: buy it before the secret of the water was revealed. They began a campaign of quiet persuasion, going from house to house, from ranch to ranch. With contracts and promises, they were skilled manipulators of hope and fear, and they found a particularly receptive ear in Abigail Loom. They flattered her, speaking of her moral leadership, and convinced her that leading her flock to a new, more fertile land was God's will. They presented her with a document, a petition. They called it, "For the orderly sale of the town's property." Her signature, they assured her, would be a beacon of wisdom for the others. Eliza felt a prickle of suspicion that she could not explain. The offer was too generous, the agent's smiles too smooth. She watched them move through the town, their polite words a stark contrast to their hungry eyes. She remembered the fake ledger book Pike had used, the way lies could be dressed up in columns and script. She went to Reverend Loom and asked to see the town's founding charter, the land registry book that was kept in a locked chest in the church. The book was heavy, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages were filled with the dense, looping script of a territorial clerk from 50 years ago. It was the most difficult, most intimidating text she had ever tried to read. She and Samuel spent 2 nights in the clinic, the lamp burning low, poring over the faded ink. He would help her with the ornate, unfamiliar letters. But it was she who pieced together the meaning, her mind now trained to look for the traps hidden in the spaces between words. And then, on the last page, in a section detailing the disposal of common property, she found it. It was a single, convoluted sentence, a legal serpent coiled in a nest of jargon. It stated that in the event of a proposed sale, if a simple majority of the registered property holders affixed their signatures to a petition of intent, the sale would be considered binding upon the entire community. It was a legal snare, designed by a long-dead lawyer to facilitate just this kind of corporate takeover. The next morning, they learned that Abigail Loom, convinced she was acting in the town's best interest, intended to sign the agent's petition that very afternoon. The printing press roared back to life. They worked with a frantic, focused energy. The leaflet they produced was their simplest yet, and their most important. At the top, in large, bold letters, it said, "Do not sign." Below, in plain, clear language that a child could understand, they explained the clause in the charter. They explained that a signature was not a vote of interest. It was a final, binding sale. They were not just selling a lot. They were selling their homes, their wells, and their future, all for a fraction of its true worth. Reverend Loom, his face pale with the realization of how close his wife had come to being an instrument of the town's destruction, threw open the doors of the church. He rang the bell, not in alarm, but in a steady, solemn summons. He announced that the church would serve as the site of a public referendum, a place for the town to make its choice with open eyes. The confrontation took place on the church steps. The 2 railroad agents stood there, their face tight with anger, the petition on a small table between them. The townspeople gathered in the dusty square, Eliza's leaflet in their hands. "This is a legal document," the lead agent said, his voice sharp with irritation. "It is a simple matter of business." Eliza stepped forward from the crowd, the heavy land registry book in her hands. She opened it to the last page. Her voice did not tremble. It was as clear and steady as the church bell. She read the clause aloud, slowly and deliberately, translating the dense legal language into plain truth. She explained how the word intent was a lie, how the word binding was the only one that mattered. A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. The agents, so accustomed to dealing with illiterate ranchers and farmers they could easily deceive, were stunned into silence. They had been outmaneuvered not by a lawyer or a politician, but by a woman with a printing press and a newfound command of the alphabet. "We are not selling," a rancher called out from the crowd, and the sentiment was echoed, a chorus of defiance that rose up from the people of Dust Haven. The agents' smooth facades finally cracked, defeated in their war of words. They fell back on the old, brutal logic of the frontier. The next day, a dozen hard-faced men, gunmen hired from a saloon in the next county, rode into town. They did not make threats. They did not have to. They sat on their horses in the center of the square, their hands resting on their pistols, a silent, menacing promise of violence. But the people of Dust Haven did not run. They did not hide. They came out of their homes, out of the mercantile and the smithy and the clinic. They came out unarmed. They walked into the square and formed a large, loose circle around the gunmen. They did not shout. They did not brandish weapons. They just stood there, men, women, and children. A silent, unbreachable wall of community. They would not be moved. The gunmen shifted in their saddles, unnerved by this quiet, unified resistance. Their brand of intimidation relied on fear and chaos, not this strange, silent courage. The standoff stretched for a long, tense hour. Then, from behind the smithy, came a sudden, sharp hiss followed by a series of deafening booms. Old Tom had lit a string of black powder firecrackers, the kind used for 4th of July celebrations. The gunmen's horses, already on edge, exploded in panic. They reared and bucked. Their professional riders suddenly transformed into clumsy amateurs struggling just to stay in the saddle. The silent square erupted into a chaos of whinnying horses and cursing men. In less than a minute, the hired guns were in full, ignominious retreat. Their flight not a battle, but a rout, a victory achieved without a single drop of blood being shed. That evening, the air was still and cool. A gentle breeze blew from the east, carrying the clean, earthy scent of distant rain. Eliza and Samuel sat on the small porch behind the clinic, the quiet rhythm of the crickets a peaceful counterpoint to the day's turmoil. "You read for the whole town today, Eliza," Samuel said, his voice full of a quiet awe. "You gave them a voice." She smiled, a small, tired smile, and leaned her head against the porch post. "And you were patient for the both of us. Samuel, you gave me the time to find my own." He was silent for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He held it in his palm. It was a ring, a simple, unadorned band. She could see in the moonlight that it was not perfect. It was slightly uneven, clearly handmade. It shone with a soft, dull gleam of silver. "It was a horseshoe nail," he said softly. "Old Tom helped me. We hammered it flat and plated it." She looked closer and saw 2 tiny, crudely scratched letters on its surface, an E and a Q. He took her hand, his own calloused and stained with ink, and held it gently. He did not get on one knee. He did not make a grand speech. He just looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and whispered the question that had been sitting between them for weeks. "Shall we write one name together?" Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She looked at his earnest, hopeful face, at the simple, beautiful ring made from the stuff of their world, and a laugh escaped her, a sound as bright and clear as a desert spring. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He started to slip the ring onto her finger, but she held up a hand, a playful, determined light in her tear-filled eyes. "Yes, but I will be writing my own signature." The wedding was not a grand affair. There was no white lace from the east, no organ music to fill the rafters. They were married on a clear, cool afternoon in the churchyard, under the wide and forgiving sky. Reverend Loom officiated, his voice quiet but steady, his words simple and true. A young cowboy sat on a barrel, playing an old, scarred guitar, the music a gentle, hopeful melody that drifted on the breeze. The entire town was there. The children from the evening school, led by Nina, stood together. They read aloud a blessing, a short piece that Eliza herself had helped them write and edit, their voices a little shaky but full of pride. Afterward, there was a celebration. It was a potluck of the truest kind. The ranchers brought beef, the farmers brought corn and squash, and those with nothing else to give brought bales of sweet-smelling hay for the horses. It was a feast of community, a testament to their shared survival. The weeks that followed were filled with the steady, rhythmic work of the press. The small, 8-page booklet was just the beginning. They gathered more knowledge. Old Tom offering his practical wisdom on mending tools safely. Nina helping to collect herbal remedies from the Tiwa women she knew. Samuel wrote chapters on sanitation and setting bones. And Eliza wrote a simple guide to mending clothes and preserving food. The result was a thick volume, bound by hand in sturdy leather. They called it the Dust Haven Handbook, Volume 1. On the cover, Eliza had printed the title herself, the letters not perfectly straight, but strong and clear. The table of contents was a map of their new world. It listed chapters like unclean water and finding the North Star. And at the end, under acknowledgments, it read, "For the contributions of Nina, our assistant teacher, and old Tom, for his lessons on safety in the forge." It was not just their book. It was the town's book. They sat one evening watching the sunset, the first finished copy resting between them. The press was quiet. "We should take it on the road," Samuel said, his voice thoughtful. Eliza looked at him. "There are other towns like this," he continued, his eyes on the horizon. "Towns with no doctors. Towns where people are afraid of words they cannot understand. We could pack the press on a wagon, a mobile school." Eliza smiled. She imagined it. The two of them riding together, bringing not just medicine, but letters, a traveling print shop. It felt right. It felt like the next right thing. The long arm of formal justice finally reached Dust Haven. A territorial judge arrived, and a proper trial was held. Gideon Rusk, facing a mountain of evidence and the testimony of a united town, was convicted of conspiracy, endangerment, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. Harlan Pike, having already been stripped of his authority by the people, was formally dismissed from his post. His badge given over to the new town council. The election for a new sheriff was held a week later. The town, in a move that surprised no one who had lived through the fire, elected old Tom as sheriff, but the most telling change was the deputy he appointed. It was Nora Pike, Harlan's younger sister. She was a quiet, plain-spoken woman who had lived her entire life in her brother's corrupt shadow, and she had chosen a different path. She was fair, she was honest, and she was not afraid. She was the first woman to wear a badge in that part of the territory, and the town saw it as nothing more than perfectly sensible. The small, lasting changes were the ones that mattered most. The mercantile, which had always run on a system of vague credit and the owner's memory, now had new signs. Jed the postman had painted them. A picture of a sack of flour next to the word flour and its price. A drawing of a hammer next to the word hammer. It was a small thing, but for the first time, everyone who walked into the store, whether they could read or not, knew they were being treated fairly. Eliza watched one afternoon as two ranch wives, women who had always made their mark with an X, stood at the counter. The owner pushed the credit ledger toward them. The women looked at each other, and then, with slow, deliberate care, one of them took the pen and signed her own name. The other followed. They were not perfect signatures, but they were theirs. One evening, as the sun was setting, Eliza and Samuel walked to the small hill overlooking the town. The sky was a deep, impossible red, the color of wet ink just before it dries. The air was still. They sat on the grass, the town spread out below them, the lights in the windows just beginning to glow. Eliza held a copy of their book. She opened it to a random page, a chapter on identifying snakes. She began to read aloud, her voice clear in the twilight. She navigated the sentences with a growing, easy confidence. Then she came to a word she did not know, something medical in Latin that Samuel had insisted on including. She stumbled, tried again, and then laughed. A soft, self-deprecating sound. "That is a terrible word," she said, shaking her head. Samuel smiled, his eyes full of a warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. He leaned over, his shoulder brushing hers. "Try it in parts," he said gently. He spoke the syllables for her, and she repeated them, tasting the strange, new shape of the word. She looked at him, her love for him a tangible thing, as solid as the ground beneath them. He said quietly that they did not write to be remembered by name. They wrote, he said, so that the people they knew, the lives they touched, would not be forgotten. Eliza nodded, understanding him completely. Dusthaven would remain a hard place. The land was not forgiving. The drought would return, as it always did. The wind would blow, and new rumors would try to take root in the dry, fearful soil of people's hearts. But something fundamental had changed. The town was no longer blind. It had a voice. The letters were not just on paper. They were in the people's hands, and in their minds. Patience, once a foreign concept to a town living on the edge of desperation, had found a home. It was the patience of a doctor waiting for a fever to break, the patience of a woman learning to trace a letter, the patience of a community learning to trust itself. The last light of the sun caught the small, glinting letters that hung on the door of the clinic and print shop. E and Q. They swayed slightly in the evening breeze. From inside, there was a sound, the steady, rhythmic clank and slide of the hand press. Nina was printing a notice for the next town meeting. The sound was not jarring, it was soft, almost like the sound of a distant, promising rain. Eliza took Samuel's hand. His skin was rough, stained with ink, and his hand was strong. She held it tight as the first stars appeared. A love story written not in the stars, but in the dust, and all the more real for it. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and give it a super thanks by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.